The human being has the genetic capacity, the capability of living healthfully to be 120 to 140, and I'm going to prove that to you in a second. There's no doubt about it. Unfortunately, Americans don't do a very good job when it comes to this. When the World Health Organization kind of looked at the top 32 industrialized nations on Earth and said, how long do these people live? Who lives the longest? We ranked 17th in longevity. There's actually 16 other countries whose peoples who live longer than we did. These are industrialized nations now. Then we ranked 19th in healthfulness. That means there was 18 other countries whose peoples live longer than we do before they develop diabetes, heart disease, arthritis, osteoporosis, and so forth. We ranked 23rd in live births and first year survivability of our babies, and we ranked dead last, 32nd out of 32, when it came to preventing birth defects. All these statistics really mean is that we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world, but not the best, and that's why many of you are here tonight, because you're seeking some information. Well, there's no less than 6 cultures on Earth whose peoples routinely live to be 120 to 140. And I'm just going to give you a very brief description. There's 2 places that you can actually pick up a lot of details. Number 1 is the January 1973 issue of National Geographic. And if you don't have the National Geographic stacked up in your garage like I do, you can go to any library and pick them up. Again, that's January 1973. They did a special issue on these cultures who lived to be over 120 to 140. And then my wife and I wrote a book in November of 1994, about 8 months ago now. And that book in chapter 8 is called The Age Beaters, not the Egg Beaters, the Age Beaters. And it goes into an enormous amount of detail of what these people do culturally and diet-wise and so forth to live healthfully to 120 to 140. Now, just very briefly, these cultures include the mountain tribes of Tibetans. And these people were made famous in 1933 at the death of a fellow by the name of Wu Li. And he was born in 1677. And if you're quick with numbers, you'll notice that he died at age 256. And when he was 106, the Chinese imperial government began publishing his birth dates and birthday parties every year for 150 years. And when he died, his obituary was in every newspaper in the world because he'd been tracked for many, many years and everybody knew him. And a year after he died, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book was published for which his life was the inspiration for this book. It was called Lost Horizon. And many of you will recall that story in that book. It talked about the Valley of Shangri-La, where people could live to be over 200 if they led a good Christian life and in fact, it was a humble agrarian, farmed and gardened, and they shunned the evil and the violence of the outside world. They could live to be over 200. And so if you haven't read that book, I'd urge you to do it. Then what is now eastern Pakistan? The Hunzas are legendary for living healthily to be over 120. And if you've hung around health food stores and read alternative health literature and nutrition literature for years, you run into the name of the Hunzas. They've been held up as being very healthful and long-lived people for over 50 years. And then during the 1970s, Dannon yogurt made the Russian Georgians famous. Some of you remember that ad. Prior to this ad, nobody could spell yogurt in America, and afterwards, of course, everybody wanted it. This is where a 140-year-old guy from Russian Georgia wore a uniform from the Crimea War, a war that took place 120 years previous, had all his medals, held up a big saber in one hand and had a cup of Dannon yogurt in the other hand, smiled a lot and waved it around. You're supposed to believe that it was Dannon yogurt that made him live to be 140. It was a very impressive ad because he had his son standing next to him who was 120, and his grandson who was 100, and his great-grandson who was 80, and so forth. So it was a very believable ad. Then after the breakup of the Soviet Union a few years ago, we began learning about other cultures in that same mountain range, the Caucasus Mountains, the Azerbaijanis, Abkhazians, Turkestanis, and the Russians studied all of these people for some 70 years and literally wrote thousands of scientific papers on their physical exams and their diets and blood tests and hair analysis, trying to figure out what it was that made these people special, because they were different races, different religions, but they had the common denominator of health and longevity. Then in the Western Hemisphere, we actually have 2 peoples that are famous for longevity. Both are in the Andes Mountains, the Vilcabamba Indians in the Andes Mountains of Ecuador, and in southeastern Peru, just east of the Peruvian city, the Aztec city of Machu Picchu, the Titicacas. I just like them because it's a fun name, the Titicacas. I mean, as an adult, how often can you say that and get away with it? Now remember, I'm from Missouri, and we're a bunch of hard-headed Dutchmen there in Missouri, and it's so noticeable and everybody knows it. So on our license plate it says we're the Show Me State. I mean, we believe nothing of what we hear and only half of what we see, and so it's pretty hard to pull the wool over our eyes. And of course, we have a bunch of farm sayings there, like I know you do here. One of my favorites is, the proof is in the pudding. That means you can tell me you're a good cook, but until I taste your cooking, I'm not going to believe you. And one of my hobbies, I have several hobbies, but one of my hobbies is collecting theories on health and longevity. And over the years, I've taken these theories and examined them to see if the proof was in the pudding. Was there any reality to these things? Was there anything to support these claims that these theories work? So I'm going to show you a few of them, and let's have a look. One of the more popular ones now is the Paleolithic diet and lifestyle. This is where you're supposed to live like a caveman. And of course, you can't eat corn-fed beef from Iowa. You have to chase down low-fat antelope by foot. You can't use an ATV or a rifle or a bow and arrow. You have to choke them to death with your bare hands. You're supposed to eat everything raw, right? And live like a caveman. If you don't sweat in your labors, you're supposed to join a health club and sweat 3 times a week. And that's the caveman or the Paleolithic lifestyle. Let's have a look and see if the proof is in the pudding. The only real hard evidence we have is this fellow here, old Otzi. And he was made famous because his mummified corpse was found in the Otzwell Valley of Italy when a glacier began to melt and recede. And when they found his corpse, all the tools and weapons he had with him were pure copper, so they knew he was from the Copper Age, somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago. And when they did carbon dating of his tissues, they found that he actually died 5,300 years ago. And through examinations of his body, they figured he died in the prime of life, somewhere between 25 and 40 years of age. And they did a series of x-rays on him to see if he had any of the diseases that plague modern man. And what they found was very surprising. Number one, they found out that he had severe degenerative arthritis of the cervical vertebrae of his neck, the lumbar vertebrae of his lower back, and both hips. And even more surprising, he had severe advanced calcification and arteriosclerosis of his coronary arteries in his heart, the aorta pulmonary artery coming out of his heart, and the large iliac arteries going down into his legs. So the proof isn't in the pudding, and I guarantee you he didn't eat 3 eggs every morning for breakfast, and certainly didn't eat any Big Macs or hamburgers or anything like that, or corn-fed beef.